requires to imagine a continent in which the rights of affectivity embodied in women and men could be considered a fundamental part of democracy, understood in a large sense, as a daily cultural dimension. Such intent involves a cultural discourse which today receives no attention in the political arena of Europe, although, neither at the continental nor at the national level, although it does find a place in the public sphere created by the feminist discourse. But this is somehow a separated public sphere. This cultural dimension connects the public and the private and reformulates both. I refer to a concept of public dimension of feelings as theorized by thinkers like Lauren Berland and Ernst Sertovich, with an affirmation of rights in the private sphere and their reverberations in the public one, therefore a radical rediscussion of the boundaries between the two, as well as between public and private memories. I would like to take as a point of departure, for what concerns the cultural memory of emotions, the novel Corinne ou l'Italie, Corinne or Italy, published by Madame de Staël in 1807 after her trip to Italy. Madame de Staël was a noblewoman, a writer and intellectual, born in the second half of the 18th century. She was the daughter of the Minister for Finances of Louis XVI, and her mother had a salon in Paris, so did she, a very important intellectual salon. But then, because Madame de Staël had very liberal ideas, she was sent into exile by Napoleon when he established his authoritarian regime. And therefore, she established her new salon in her castle at Coppet in Switzerland. She was of Swiss-French origin, and she traveled widely through Europe. This novel, which has been largely forgotten in comparison with other works by Madame de Staël, is relevant to us because the central figure is Corinne, a woman, an artist of great versatility, excellent in many fields, endowed with many natural gifts, poetry, painting, singing, dancing, a beautiful and generous woman who enjoys a great success in the city of Rome where she lives. She's actually born of a British nobleman and an Italian lady, and she is the archetype of the cosmopolitan woman because she speaks many languages, the important European languages for the cultural sphere at the time: Italian, French, German, English, and she is actually at ease in these various countries for what concerns her capacity to interact. Corinne has a sad story, a tragic story. Her mother died when she was 10, and she lived in Florence for some years with an aunt, who then also died, and her father, who had remarried with a Scottish woman, called her to Scotland. In this country is used by Madame de Staël to evidence the difference in the bringing up of young women and women. Because in this country, Corinne experienced the harshness of an education imposed by her stepmother according to local customs, which obliged women to be educated only for marriage, devoted to a husband and a home. And then she had to flee to Rome and left behind her beloved stepsister Lucille, who could not escape the destiny of being educated only for the home. This story is a mirror of Madame de Staël's experience of being an exceptional woman, being Madame de Staël herself objects to this expression. She thought that many women could become so-called exceptional ones if they were allowed to develop freely. So it's not that women are exceptional, some women are exceptional because of some gifts, but because they have been allowed. So the destiny is a mirror of a destiny of a woman in a society that did not recognize women's rights to education and to an honest, independent life. Madame de Stael herself experienced the suffering that such a woman had to face in love relationships with men who preferred less independent women. Her love story was with the intellectual Benjamin Constant, who actually married more of a housewife. And the whole idea is that Corinne prefigures a cultured and liberated woman in a free and united Europe. The dream that Madame de Stael nourished with her group of friends from various European countries at the castle in Coppet. The liberal ideas of the author are transparent in the novel. For instance, there is great space dedicated to the fact that Napoleon looted the Italian works of art and brought them to Paris. And so it's not only for her liberal ideas, but also for her denunciation that Napoleon disliked this novel in particular, as well as Madame de Stael. The attitudes of her epoch are presented as too narrow and limiting for Corinne, especially in the field of affective relationship. So she's not important for us because she represents an exceptional intellectual woman, but because she represents the struggle of women for the right to affectivity as a form of subjectivity. So this is the meaning of the fact that she is loved in this novel by various men from various different countries, European countries, Italy, France, Germany, Britain. Of course, this is a Eurocentric view, and it's even not only Eurocentric, it's Western Eurocentric. It's a typical Enlightenment position. And all of these men are described by the author of the novel as very limited in their views by narrow national outlooks. They are very national. They are the stereotypes of nationality. So the French is frivolous, and the Italian is a generous prince, and so on. But Corinne is the only European. She is, in comparison with these men encapsulated in their nationalities, she has a wider outlook. And she falls in love, reciprocated, with a British nobleman, Lord Nelvil, but he is afraid of marrying such an independent woman and chooses to follow his father's posthumous advice to marry instead Corinne's stepsister, Lucille. In the course of this dramatic experience, Corinne loses all her creativity and ends up letting herself die after having taught music to her niece, Lucille's and Neville's daughter. This young woman, very similar to Corinne, will continue a genealogy of women through her art and her heritage. The Europe that Corinne prefigures has a great cultural memory, but also a memory of oppression and repression, of exclusion of many from the enjoyment of rights in the public and the private spheres. It is a memory of repression of civic rights by authoritarian regimes, but for what concerns women, also by democratic regimes, such as the British one. A marriage with Corinne is seen by her lover, Lord Nelvil, as a double transgression to the law of the father and to the law of the fatherland. A betrayal of the customs of his country, which, however, is portrayed in the novel as highly civilized in other respects, than for what concerns the cultural and emotional condition of women. Significantly, it is a woman who is not prey of the prejudices held by men that can represent a different, free, united Europe and becomes a figure for a possible European memory. At the same time, Corinne's story is a warning of the terrible loss of memory that European society has for a long time imposed on women and their history. Corinne cannot live in the Europe of her time. She must die because she is so much in advance with respect to the society of her age. And the memory for which Corinne's story constitutes a cultural foundation is, as I have said, the attention, a memory attentive to the sphere of sentiments, a memory of emotions as a basis for both the public and the private spheres concerning everybody in their daily life. Historically, the link between a European sphere understood as public and the private sphere has been established by many Europeanists, perhaps the best known being Denis de Rougemont. It is to him that we owe the expression a Europe of sentiment, understood as a sense of belonging which is both cultural and personal and tinted with nostalgia for the past. However, it was Ursula Hirschman who gendered the concept. Ursula Hirschman might not be very well known. She has become now in Europe. She was born, I think, in 1913 in Berlin from a Jewish family, and her brother was Albert Hirschman. And but Albert said he lost one N in this country because his Hirschman was written on it. Anyway, they both had to flee from Berlin because of the Nazis and went first to Paris and then to Rome. And Ursula became very active in the anti-fascist movement, and she also was active in the federalist movement. So she participated in writing the 1941 Manifesto for a United Europe, which was not only an anticipation of the European Union, but actually it is still much forward than the European Union itself, because it projected an idea of justice and equality for all. Ursula Hirschman insisted on the link between the public and the private, and on the possibility of feeling at the same time a subject of Europeanness and of love. She created a group of Europeanist women, Femmes pour l'Europe, Women for Europe, in 1975 in Brussels. And this group is interesting because it was composed largely of the wives of Europe bureaucrats. And these women felt unhappy in their role of wives. So they chose the word femme, which in French means both women and wives, to actually expose the idea of being only wives. They wanted to be perceived as protagonists of the European life, having been militants, but actually also simply in terms of their gendered condition. The memory that they transmit to us, however, cannot help being subjected to criticism. It is true that they connected the idea of love and the idea of Europe, but this connection still had some element of subordination. Subordination in the role of wife, and also some elements of Eurocentrism. They included in their writings declarations such as that they felt the European sisters of migrant women. And there was in these sort of declarations a type of what was called in the 70s soutienisme, an attitude of support for the underprivileged, which is not really based on equality. However, their choice to be identified with Europe in the most difficult conditions and to act consciously as Europeanists has a value for the construction of the memory of Europe based on passion, a passion that connected the private and the political, and that involved always some type of affection. The intersubjective nature of the enterprise of Femmes pour l'Europe contains positive aspects to be rescued and elaborated together with the criticism of its anachronistic for us today aspects. Thus, in this sense, if subjected to this re-elaboration, their effort can become a part of a memory for a possible Europe. I will now turn to the area of communicative memory, the communicative memory of emotions, taking my examples from the research Gender Relationships in Europe, which was done, supported by the European Union in the years 2000-2004, and connected 5 European universities, among which Utrecht, Florence, and Copenhagen, Budapest, and Sofia. This research is already known to some extent to the participants in my class, but I will just give some elements of it to connect with the cultural memory of emotions. This research studied the oral memories of women migrants from Bulgaria and Hungary to Italy and the Netherlands. In their memory narratives, the sphere of affectivity was very present, sometimes in connection with the question of being European. In the Bulgarian interviews, meaningful replies to the questions on Europe were given in correspondence with contemporary political events, but also on the basis of personal bonds. The private was present in a new sense of belonging that could be evinced from some replies. For instance, on the basis of the ancient self-representation of woman as mother, which seems to solve or overcome the problematic nature of the European rhetoric of unity. This is the case of a statement by a Bulgarian woman claiming to be one of the female ancestors of a new generation of Europeans. More often, the love of the couple is mentioned in the narratives of the Bulgarian and Hungarian women, who give this as a reason for migration in order to rejoin either a husband or a boyfriend. The discourse on love emerges as a constant element of these memories, even through declarations ex negativo, such as my goal was obviously, she is Bulgarian, my goal was obviously to see, to learn, to visit, I haven't met my great love, as if the imaginary around migration necessarily included love in one way or another. In real life, sometimes migration induced a breakup. And therefore, this memory is very strongly connected with an imaginary of love. There are important elements given also, however, in the interviews about the fact that even democratic states like the Netherlands practice a sort of invasion of the private and intimate sphere by obliging people who want to marry, if they are not on its territory, if they are not of Dutch nationality, to prove in some way that they are actually in love and not contracting a so-called fake marriage. So there are these elements of connection between interpenetration between public and private. In the interviews, a flexible attitude emerges in the sense of a capacity to move, motivated by love relationships, and at the same time by the wish to learn languages, find new jobs, bridge cultural differences. Love appears, in a certain sense, to be a force pushing towards a continental dimension. And it is, however, paired with nationality. Therefore, it is an emotion that does not rule out other emotions, such as the pride for one's nationalities or for one's work. For what concerns Europe, the interviews with Bulgarians and Hungarians seem to confirm at a simpler level of expression what the experience of Femmes pour l'Europe suggested. Tentative new ways of feeling European are possible, linked with new developments in emotional life, capable of bringing the contribution of the private into the public. Personal memories offer instances of a love that is a driving force in bridging cultural differences, one of the forces that move people towards change. At the same time, informed by previous and new loyalties. This approach is adequate to situations undergoing changes, since it is pragmatic, attentive to personal feelings and to cultural traditions of different countries. Although this basis for new forms of Europeanness can also be seen as frail and contradictory. In this sense, the combination of the personal memories of women migrants with the cultural memories represented by Corinne through the mediation of Femmes pour l'Europe is relevant, because it is this combination of different cultural and communicative memories of emotions that can create somehow the image of new Corinnes who narrate their stories of migrations and their own memories, following, like the protagonist of Madame de Staël's novel, love bonds, but unlike her, claiming to be able to find new ways of life that accommodate their emotions, although in an often difficult and risky manner. Therefore, I see both continuity and discontinuity between these different memories, cultural and communicative, but I see them converging to combine, to compose a complicated pattern of possible memories of emotions. And this complication is in the sense that there are many breaks in the memories of Europe, which are multiple not only in a horizontal or synchronic sense, but also in a vertical or diachronic one. There is no continuous line of memory from Aristotle to Maastricht, as it is claimed by those who hold the view of an essential European identity to be promoted and defended by a cultural fortress Europe. And so there is not an absolute continuity between Madame de Staël, Ursula Hirschman, and the Bulgarian and Hungarian migrants. But I think they can be, that bridges can be established by us for them. So I can go to the second part of my talk. As you might have guessed from what I've been saying, for many years I've been engaged in the task of criticizing Eurocentrism from within, believing that this task was an urgent one in order to move the post-colonial glance from external to internal relationship. And this included the attention for the so-called internal other. The internal other being, one example of internal other being in my recent work, the Jewish cultures of love in the Europe of the 20th century, following the view that the Jews represented for a long time the internal other of Europe. I also share the conviction of a close link between the conceptualization of the internal other and of the external others. So if there is an internal other, it's because there have been external others. This was evident, for instance, in the type of racist discourses developed by Nazism and Italian fascism, which put together the Jews and Negroes precisely on the point of their incapability to experience courtly and romantic love, a supposedly European exclusive specialty. However, this is a historical perspective, but I also share Talal Assad's conviction that in Europe today, Arabs are the present day's Jews. In more precise quotation from Talal Assad, he says, nowadays in the West, Arabs and Muslims have to some extent replaced the Jews, both as an undesirable element in our society and as a symbol of the insidious power of money. All right, so all this is just to hint that some more of my work, but I want to leave aside my own work now and to switch from an inside to an outside critique of Eurocentrism. And at the same time, to operate that change in the meaning of the expression memory of Europe, which I said is also grammatical and syntactical, in the sense that until now I have spoken as if memory of Europe meant the memory that Europeans have of themselves or of Europe. Now, I want to ask to transform Europe not in a subject of memory, but into an object of memory. Who remembers Europe? And who remembers Europe means what is remembered about Europe and about which Europe do people talk who remember it. Therefore, I turn to ongoing research being done by young scholars on the memory of the European colonial heritage in the ongoing diaspora of people from the whole world that crosses the continent of these days. One reason for this choice is the relevance that memories of colonialism have today in a post-colonial Europe. Very often with an insufficient attention to it, certainly so in my own country, Italy. By post-colonial, I mean a type of glance, a type of gaze, which takes into account that colonialism has existed and has, to a certain extent, unified the globe, and therefore is the premise to globalization. It's a form of globalization. So global and post-colonial glance are linked strictly together. Another reason for this switch of attention from the internal to the external other is that the internal other represented by the Jews has been privileging the memory of the Shoah and making out of it a screen memory that has contributed to silence the experience of some other internal other, such as the Rome people, Black Europeans, homosexual, but also very much the memory of colonialism. And therefore, I want to go. I think that any discourse on memory of Europe today must be taking into account the memories of immigrants, better defined in academic terms as diasporic subjects, but also perhaps this is a word which is very cryptic to many immigrants themselves. Not that they always accept the term migrants. So I use the term migrants as a shortcut, but I know it's not a very good choice. But it is they who bring to Europe the awareness of its colonial past and sometimes combine it with the decision of being in some way and at least partially European. This second part will be largely, but not only, centered on living memories, whether oral or written. They could be combined with cultural memories, but and I don't think we have the time to go deep into that, but I will mention with which cultural memories they can be combined. And then we might eventually pick this topic up in the discussion. I'm thinking of memories such as the ones about which Paul Gilroy has written in Black Atlantic. Memories of black people from the United States who decide to cross the ocean in the opposite direction, from opposite to the slave trade, crossing the Atlantic to Europe, and rediscovering the value of the heritage of rights in Europe, the heritage, not necessarily the practice, and their capacity of playing this heritage against racism in the United States. According to Paul Gilroy, this recrossing of the Atlantic towards Europe, Germany, France, Britain, by people like W.E.B. Du Bois or Richard Wright or so on, developed a double consciousness. And it is this double consciousness of belonging, not one belonging, but a multiple type of belonging, which is at the basis of the type of memory I'm thinking of now for Europe as well. But now let us go to the living memories. I will start from the work of a young researcher, Leslie Hernandez Nova. She's from Mexico, and she has been interviewing Peruvian women migrants to the North Italian region of Piedmont and interpreting their memories. She has noticed that the narrations of Peruvian women migrants share, as a central focus of collective memory, a strongly emotional image of the conquista, considered as the beginning of colonial relationships in a process of union and separation at the same time. The conquista is seen as the point of encounter between various South American countries and at the same time the transversal line that connects this territory with Europe. This event has left deep traces in their collective memory and is the basis for their present perceptions of Europe. The collective memory in oral terms, the collective memory of the conquista as they present it, owes much to cultural memory embodied in historical, filmic, and literary texts. Thus, the migration to the European continent is framed in a global dimension, and the conquista is understood as a major step in the process of unification of the planet, but also the beginning of displacement at the world level. The territorial sense of belonging to Latin America, which is supranational, induces in the Peruvian women's memories a perception of Europe from a geocultural perspective. In this perspective, Europe is seen as a unified space composed of many nations and territories. It's a territory sometimes seen as more united than it really is, since the migrants project the unifying vision of Latin American culture on the European case. In many narrations, Italy, Spain, Germany, and Europe are mentioned as equivalent, although Spain maintains a prominent role as a place where the migrants find the roots of one of their languages. The interpretation proposed by Leslie Hernandez is that the wider sense of belonging developed on the basis of the migration and coupled with the memory of the conquista produces a new form of subjectivity. This embraces both the supranational sense of belonging to Latin America and the possible sense of belonging to Europe, with some limitations in the case of the second. There are, in fact, aspects of identity which cannot be included in this second sense of belonging. There is a sort of permanent laceration already present in a memory centered on colonial conquest, oppression, and destruction. The limits of the identification as Europeans are to be found in the suffering that living and moving in Europe imply for the migrants, to the difficulties of all sorts that they meet. Their return trips to Peru strengthen the sense of double belonging, but at the same time also the lacerations inside this sentiment. When back in the country of origin, the migrant hears her friends and relatives who stayed behind express their admiration and envy to her for having chosen Europe, where life is supposed to be better than in the other country of destination, the United States. But she, the migrant woman, keeps, almost as a secret, the memory of her suffering in Europe, thinking that those who stayed behind don't know what it is really like. No memory of Europe today can be built without these multiple memories of migrants, which include often a fragmented sense of the potential belonging to Europe. In other words, besides exploring the past to look for forms of forgotten memories, we must at the same time explore the present to find traces of the future. The memories of the word migrants that move across Europe today evidence forms of conflictual intersubjectivity understood as a relationship between different cultures through the past and the present. Their cultures of mobility involve the internalization of the migratory process with the emotions it entails, emotion in a larger sense than the love of the couple that concur to constitute the migrants' memories. The itineraries of the migrants towards and through the European continent operate the process of deterritorialization, which does not merely problematize the traditional borders of Europe as fixed, but also brings to new recognition various forms of multiple attachments to more than one place inside and outside the continent. Practices of mobility inside and from outside Europe are central for the redefinition of memories in a post-colonial global perspective. The historical presence of mobile subjects and their contribution to the circulation of cultures and of practices challenge the Eurocentric racial and national assumptions of a homogeneous white and male European public sphere and identity, by placing Europe in a new relationship with the rest of the world as well as with its internal margins. In the course of this process, living memory assumes a post-colonial dimension, not in the sense of a factual testimony, but thanks to the symbolic value of its message. This is why I would like now to go to a post-colonial memory which is being constructed in Italian by writers of Ethiopian, Eritrean, and Somali origin. Italian colonialism in those areas lasted from 1882 to 1941. It is interesting that the great majority of these new writers are women, in a process relatively new for Italy and closely linked in its growing dimension with the immigration from the south of the world to Italy in the very last decades. On this topic, I take my examples as well from the work of young researchers who are studying post-colonial Italian literature. On the basis of published and unpublished autobiographical novels, Moira Luraski, another of these young researchers, has found that during the first phases of the African migration to Italy, the migrants had an image of Europe that coincided with that of Italy, while in the last 20 years, Europe started to be conceived as a unitary bloc within which it became possible to choose among various countries of destination, including Italy. This change in perception testifies an enlargement of the vision of Europe and a redefinition of the image of Italy, as well as a modification of memory in respect to the relationship between Europe and its nations. At the same time, the memory of Italian colonialism remains central. For instance, Luraski's analysis confirms the role of memories of métissage and of madamato. Madamato was the cohabitation of African women called madame and Italian men, mostly military, in the 1930s. This practice was declared illegal by the fascist government in 1937. It was a crime. Their memories of abused women's bodies have been transmitted through generations on the basis of oral narrations that connect the past and the present. Bodies convey a monastic trace of colonialism, and the very language chosen for writing down these transmitted memories, Italian, is such a trace, because it brings within itself the memory of colonization. At the same time, its choice corresponds to the decision to break the silence and turn upside down the imposed heritage. Thus, the transmitted memory of Madamato takes a new light in a European context, and so does the role of the stories of immigrant women in this context. There are many of these autobiographies and novels, and I cannot quote them all, but I will quote one by Shirin Ramzali Fazel, analyzed by another young researcher, Gabriele Proglio, because she gives central relevance to the transmission of memories from her childhood in Somaliland. And these memories insist on the urban landscape of Mogadishu, which is marked by the traces of colonialism in signs and names. And in an African country, these signs and names are all in Italian: Bar Impero, Via Roma, Scuola Regina Elena, Chiesa del Sacro Cuore. And it is this memory which is at the heart of the transmission of memory that the author moved to Italy in 1971, and she intends to transmit this memory to her children, thus to perform an intersubjective gesture between generations. In this case, too, the language adopted for the transmission of memory is the site of an imposed intersubjectivity, which is prolonged in an intersubjectivity experienced in Italy, often conflictual, with elements of paternalistic benevolence, xenophobia, and sometimes racism. Language, in hybridizing the stories of the past, is connected with memory. It is itself a form of memory. A form of memory that mixes the cultural and the communicative. As Lydia Curti, author of the book La voce dell'altra, The Voice of the Other Woman, has written, language becomes a place of encounter between refugees, exiled, migrants, giving rise to a different intersubjectivity that transforms the memory of the past into a stance towards a transcultural present. Such memory is in fact the result of a negotiation with various epochs, places, and cultures. I am concluding. The Europe that is remembered by the diasporic subjects that cross the continent today is a Europe of oppression and exclusion, of destruction and disunion. Yet at the same time, the migrants are able to express new forms of subjectivity which include a contradictory affectivity towards Europe, an emotional investment which comprises but is larger than the private loves, and which can contribute to create new senses of belonging while modifying the existing ones. As Derrida said, one can feel European among other things, and among others, namely on the side of the other. I have insisted on the multiplicity of memories for Europe, of women and men, of native Europeans and of diasporic subjects in oral and written forms, but it cannot be an undifferentiated multiplicity. Within this multiplicity, I propose to carve itineraries that correspond to certain priorities and operate resolute choices. Priorities are dictated, I believe, by the imagination of future possible Europes, which add a touch of utopia to the existing Europe, on the basis of memories transmitted from the recent and remote past of the continent. Therefore, I insist on the link between memory on one side and utopian imagination on the other, in order to make choices within the multiple memories of Europe. The expression memory of Europe should always be understood as a phrase in which Europe can be both a subject and an object. In the double sense of remembering herself, as Europe is symbolized by a woman and of being, or by a female figure, and of being remembered by those who were considered her others. Thank you.
Thank you.